Greetings, everyone. 1,000 thanks once again for tuning in. For tonight's literary outing, I will of course be discussing the fourth entry in K.A. Applegate's Animorphs series, The Message. The Message, like all books in the main series, is told from the point of view of one of the 5 shifty eyes main characters, and in this case is our first outing with Cassie behind the proverbial wheel. Cassie is pretty much the heart of the Animorphs team. Both of her parents are veterinarians, and so she's pretty much grown up around animals her entire life. She loves animals, and it is perhaps because of her compassion for the furred and feathered among us that she also carries the most genuine, selfless love for her fellow humans. This, when juxtaposed against the relationship that the rest of the Animorphs have with the Yeerks, puts Cassie in a unique position. Jake wants to save his brother, Rachel wants to save Melissa, and I guess her cousin Tom. Tobias feels a special connection to the Andalites, and Marco, well, stay tuned. But Cassie just wants to save mankind, or rather, just life. I mean, so does the rest of the team, but it's not their priority. The point is, Cassie, because of her overall compassion, simultaneously lacks any personal motivation in this war, but also has the most to lose. This book was first published by Scholastic in October of 1996. Despite everything that I just said about Cassie, it actually lacks a lot of the emotional nuance and relatability of the 2 books prior, and it's mostly narrative-driven. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and I'm sure that Cassie becomes a more interesting character later on, but coming off of the Visitor and the Encounter, it's definitely a change of pace, and it feels a little bit more like Book 1. Subjectively, I generally lean a little bit more toward emotional development and character growth, but sometimes you just gotta buckle down and move that story along, and rest assured, this book does introduce at least one major plot point? Development? Device? Thing that drastically affects the series moving forward. So let's get into it. Spoiler warning, blah blah, read a book. The book opens with a scene in which Cassie attempts a squirrel morph in her family barn in hopes of figuring out what entity has been sneaking into the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center and killing animals. Why she couldn't morph something a little bit more menacing? I don't know, but whatever. It's a fox. It turns out to be a fox. The scene really has no bearing on the rest of the story, aside from the fact that Cassie and a visiting Tobias realize that they've both been experiencing the same recurring dream. The next day, the team is meeting in Rachel's room to discuss this oddity. Apparently, they've both been dreaming about a voice calling to them from the ocean. In light of this, Jake reveals that he saw on the news last night that some random schlub had found some weird, mysterious, alien, wreckage on the beach. In fact, Jake vaguely recognized some of the strange writing on the flotsam, or jetsam? I don't really know the difference. The point is, he thinks it's from an Andalite ship, which means that this is suddenly an Animorphs issue. Almost on cue, Cassie gets lightheaded and passes out, as does Tobias, and during their little naps, they both have the dream again, and fortunately wake up just in time to prevent the team from calling an ambulance. After a little discussion, everyone agrees that the shared dreams about the ocean and the probably Andalite flotsam, I looked it up, found on the beach, which is famously near the ocean, are probably related. They resolve to get to the bottom of it. So, they head down to the beach some night to look for anything they might be able to use. But of course, the sharing is there looking for exactly the same thing. When the gun-toting controllers become aware of their presence, they retreat into the ocean and morph into the trout from the last book. They swim down the beach, their gills burning the whole time, and manage to find safety before they die of dehydration, oversalinization. The point is that they escape. After laying low for a couple of days, Jake randomly shows up at Cassie's barn. He asks her about the dream and legitimately wants to know whether or not she feels like it's something that they should continue to pursue. She's a little mixed up on the issue because while she does think that they're probably important, she's also not super psyched at the idea of taking the blame should something go wrong. As the de facto leader, Jake offers to make the decision for her, but she ultimately decides for herself that it's worth looking into, and despite some ethical quandaries, they're highly intelligent, it feels wrong. The two of them realize that their best course at this point is to once again visit the gardens and acquire some dolphin morphs. They does so, and unlike their last visit back in Book 1, it's super easy what with swimming with the dolphins and shit like that being an actual thing. I mean, a staff member is literally standing right next to them when the team acquires the creature. The crux of the scene is a brief conversation after the fact in which Cassie questions the ethicality of acquiring an intelligent animal, and compares it to what the Yeerks are doing, which is of course completely retarded because turning into something that's genetically identical to something else is way less bad than literally taking over that thing's life. It really just feels like an effort on the author's part to inject an ethical dilemma into a place that reason doesn't really allow for it, but Cassie is a teen-year-old hippie, so I'll let it slide. After another night of her recurring dream, the voice notably fainter in it, Cassie and the gang return to the beach, or rather some estuary, so that they can morph into dolphins, and hopefully get a handle on the dolphins' instincts, but more ideally, possibly find some sort of clue as to where they should be looking. Yeah, they don't. They swim their way out to sea, and after playing around for a bit with their newfound command of the water and sweet echolocation skills, they encounter the classic Spielbergian antagonist, Jaws. And Jaws 2. And 3 and 4. And a fifth shark that doesn't really fit with this joke. And they're all attacking a humpback whale. Or great one, as Cassie's dolphin brain instinctively calls it. Now, as we all know, dolphins are well equipped to deal with sharks, so the battle to save the beast goes relatively smoothly. But, unlucky chap that he is, Marco ends up with his flukes basically ripped clean off. There's blood everywhere. There's a brief moment of panic before someone suggests that maybe Marco should try morphing back to human and hopefully regrow or mend some of the damaged bits. Now, Marco doesn't know how to swim, and he has lost a lot of blood, but buoyed by his dolphinist companions, he manages to power through it, and not surprisingly, every body part ends up right back where it should be. Suddenly, the weirdest thing happens. The humpback rises from below, providing the helpless teenager with a raft of sorts. And then, through means I don't really understand, the whale speaks to them. Cassie describes the experience as follows. A silent but somehow huge voice filled my head. It spoke no words, it simply filled every corner of my mind with a simple emotion. Gratitude. It's through this weird, empathic language, I guess you could call it, that the whale tells Cassie his story. He's lived for over 80 years, he's had many lovers and children, he's seen the North and South Poles, he fought in both World War II and Korea, and he invented the smokeless ashtray. But there is one particular detail that catches her attention. There's something new in the ocean. A ship, with a big transparent dome on it and a grassy field inside. Its sole inhabitant, drumroll please, an Andalite. As a parting gift, the Leviathan reveals the vessel's location to Cassie, and the kids head back to shore. The next day, Cassie goes to visit Marco at his home. She's feeling guilty about him almost dying as a result of a decision that she made. Marco, while not dismissive of the fact that, yeah, that whole operation was kind of a nightmare for him, insists that it's really not her fault. Cassie also reveals that she saw earlier on the news today that they were talking about how folks seem to have a sudden increased interest in exploring the local sea. It's pretty clearly the controllers looking for, well, exactly what the Animorphs are looking for. Cassie tries to convince Marco to convince her to not convince him to help explore any further, but in the end, Marco just offers a paraphrase of Rush's Free Will. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You know the one. Which I appreciate, even though in all likelihood it was completely unintentional. So, some other day, the team meets to discuss further investigation. Now, research indicates that the locale they're seeking is quite a ways out to sea. So the plan is to hide aboard some passing cargo ship that's headed in the right direction, disguised as seagulls, and when they get close enough, to dive in and swim for the alleged crashed ship. So, well, that happens. They morph into seagulls and land on a passing freighter where they demorph and hide until they're nearby where Cassie thinks they're supposed to go. Which makes perfect sense to me as a 2017 adult, but how did they know as pre-ish teens in the mid-90s? It doesn't really matter. They reach the drop point and the kids jump overboard, assuming they're dolphin-y forms, and as they set to dive, they note, hey, there's a helicopter hovering over this particular stretch of ocean. So, that's a thing. They find, almost too easily, the Andalite dome ship for which they're looking, and head into the airlock, which they recognize by pure luck. And only by further luck do they manage to figure out the controls to make it do what it's supposed to do, just in time for them to get a much-needed intake of oxygen. Oh, right, because dolphins have lungs. In any case, I guess Steve Jobs was an Andalite because their interface is super user-friendly. They figure out how to get the door open as well, only to get blasted in the face by some sort of stun beam or something. When the team comes to, they find themselves in a pastoral but alien meadow, blanketed in blue grass and dotted with large, weird asparagus-like trees. There's even a cute little babbling brook. And of course, a very suspicious half-deer, half-man, half-scorpion blue alien looming over them, threatening to light them up with Dracon if they try anything funny. I guess that sky should technically be ocean, too. Doing her best to speak as non-aggressively as possible, Cassie explains that they're there to help, that she's been receiving his distress calls, and that they're human allies of the Andalites, which seems a little odd to him because the humans aren't supposed to know anything about the Andalites, but they tell him about the night at the construction site and name-drop Prince Elfangor, mentioning that he gave his life to save their planet. Which is a little upsetting to the alien because turns out Elfangor was his brother. And of course, to add insult to injury, they tell him that he was killed by none other than Visser III himself. Naturally, with his highly evolved alien brain, this new Andalite manages to grieve for less than a page as the kids catch him up on the situation here on Earth. The gift of morphing, the secret invasion, some of their shitty attempts to fight back, and finally he introduces himself as Aximili Escaroth Istil. Apparently his ship crashed during the very battle that landed his brother in the construction site that night. Almost immediately he pledges his life to Jake, the prince of the Animorphs as he sees it, and vows to aid them in their battle against the Yeerk invasion. At least until he can figure out how to get back to his cousins. During a brief tour, Axe answers a few of their questions, revealing to the shock of the children, granola child Cassie in particular, that the Yeerks don't simply strive to take over the Earth. Their goal is to literally destroy all life, at least all life they can't use, and make the planet as barren and inhospitable as their own homeworld. Which I guess had never occurred to any of them. It doesn't really change their situation at all, but I guess like Tom for Jake or Melissa for Rachel, Cassie needed her personal reason. And as she is so bloody compassionate, this kind of makes sense. As this new reality is sinking in, their placid dread is thankfully interrupted by a freaking depth charge. Fortunately, it's not enough to shatter the dome, but it's sure as hell enough to get everyone off their figurative asses and head for the exit. Huddled in the airlock, the team resumes their dolphin forms as Axe transforms himself into, full circle, a great white shark. I guess one of them wandered a little too close to the ship one day, so Axe took it upon himself to acquire it. They peel out of there as fast as their fins can carry them, but as they approach the surface, the unmistakable silhouette of Visser 3's blade ship looms overhead, and before long, a band of surprisingly hydrodynamic taxons are slithering their way toward our heroes. While the ugly grubs are unexpectedly fast in the water, they're easily outmaneuvered by dolphin and shark alike. The Animorphs make swift work of them and quickly formulate a plan. Head for the nearest island. Head for land when you're stranded in the middle of the ocean. That's genius. Fortunately, apparently Axe, or possibly all Andalites, has a very finely tuned internal clock, so the threat of being trapped in Morph seems less, well, threatening. As the team charges away, the good Visser makes his mandatory appearance, this time as a Mardrut, which is some sort of giant aquatic alien thing from one of the Andalite moons. Thank you, Axe. After half an hour of swimming as fast as they can, the children begin to grow weary. But the Visser has lost no speed. Sensing that the end is near, as a last-ditch effort, Cassie pings out an echolocation call for help, which is a thing dolphins can do, apparently. And the team resolves that it's better to go out fighting than, I don't know, not fighting. They turn to face the Mardrut, and then wham! The Visser's struck by a huge waterborne entity. And then another, and then another. Turns out, Cassie's call worked. A whole pod of cachalots, those are sperm whales for those who don't know. Sperm. Heard the plea, and responded in turn. And who should be with them but the Great One, the humpback from before? Tough as the Visser's Mardrut morph is, nothing can last long with a half-dozen whales wailing on it. So he retreats. With the morph clock almost up, the mighty humpback lends himself once again to the children as they demorph. Atop the living island, Jake and Cassie discuss the literal insanity of the day, reflecting on the revelation that, in their own way, whales really are as intelligent as humans. Also, the ethics of morphing a dolphin. Jake seems to think that if they could ask and explain the imminent destruction, they'd probably be okay with it, but Cassie thinks they'd probably just think it was a big game. Clearly, she's never read Hitchhiker's Guide. But anyway, everyone swims back to shore and demorphs. With a new non-human member, they need to figure out where and how to keep this guy, but Axe helps out with that at least a little bit by acquiring Jake, Rachel, Cassie, and Marco and sort of amalgamating them into a single male human morph, which raises all sorts of questions, but I'll get into that later. They ultimately decide that the best, safest place for him is probably wandering the outskirts of Cassie's farm, which again borders a national forest. In the final chapter, Cassie sneaks once again into the gardens under the guise of a seagull and the cover of night. She lands at the dolphin tank and morphs a dolphin herself so that she can commune with her new brothers and sisters. Like most characters seem to have at the end of their first book, she's found her personal reason to defeat the Yeerks. It's a little broader than everybody else's, but it really is the only thing that could work for her unusual Jedi love. So that's the massage. Like I said, it's more story-driven than the last couple of books, but we do get to know Cassie a little bit better. Which is good, because in many ways she's kind of the least relatable of the team. Or at least was, before a literal extraterrestrial showed up. Don't get me wrong. I know that there are people out there who legitimately love the idea of life more than they love any specific living thing. I sometimes even find myself adjacent to them, but I feel like most normal people are far more willing to take on such a monumental task for the sake of a specific person or persons that they really care about. Make no mistake, people like Cassie are absolutely wonderful, and we need them. But I admit that I personally found myself more connected to the narrative in this book than to Cassie's personal journey. Wow, that was a weak ending. What happened to my vest?